Welcome to 5 Minutes with Robert Adams, where I share my findings from the Bible about the end time, and especially that which concerns the return of Jesus. This is episode 11. People who believe in Jesus will be present in the Great Tribulation. This can be seen from the book of Revelation that mentions saints who have faith in Jesus during this time. The question is whether all these people become believers after the beginning of the tribulation. This isn't an insignificant detail because many claim that Jesus will fetch his church to heaven before the tribulation and that the believers we read about in the tribulation belong to another group. Jesus spoke about the tribulation period in a number of passages. He spoke about the time both before, during, and after the tribulation. If we can find out whom Jesus spoke to and whom he spoke of, then we will be able to clear up the issue of whether or not the end-time believers are to be divided into two groups. That is, on the one hand, the church, and on the other, believers in the tribulation. When Jesus held his end-time discourse, the Gospel of Mark tells us he was speaking to 4 of his disciples. They were Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Jesus said, "You," many times in his discourse. He was evidently referring to his first disciples, but also to future disciples, since Jesus told his first disciples many of them would be killed because of their faith. Jesus said the words "you" and "your" 21 times, 10 times before he mentions the Great Tribulation, 3 times in the course of the tribulation period, and 8 times afterward. Jesus directed the whole of his end-time discourse to his disciples and makes no difference between disciples living before the tribulation and disciples present in the tribulation. According to Jesus, disciples are present on the earth until he comes in glory just after this time. Therefore, there is no reason to divide the believers in the end time into two groups and say that some of the disciples are the church and some belong to another group in the tribulation. On the contrary, we see one flock of disciples that Jesus calls my church in the Gospel of Matthew. Some make a point of the fact that the disciples Jesus spoke to were Jews, and that he therefore spoke of the Jews in the end time. However, we have to remember that Peter and John, who were among those Jesus spoke to on this occasion, were, according to the book of Galatians, regarded as pillars in Christ's church. All the early believers in the church were Jews, and only later did non-Jewish people become believers and thus part of the church. Many Gentiles were saved, especially through the ministry of Paul, and soon they became a majority in the church. We must therefore conclude that Jesus directed his end-time discourse to the whole of his church, consisting of believing Jews and Gentiles. Besides using the words "you" and "your," Jesus also employed the phrase "the elect" in his end-time discourse. Jesus then defines who they are by saying they are those whom he has chosen. This aligns with the Gospel of John, where Jesus said to his disciples, "I have chosen you out of the world." The elect are therefore followers of Jesus. Peter wrote to believers and called them elect. Also, Paul addressed the believers in the city of Colossae as the elect of God. This is, of course, a reference to the church. Therefore, when Jesus spoke of his elect, he was referring to his church. Accordingly, the elect of Christ are synonymous with the church of Christ, which he said he would build. Jesus said concerning his elect and the Great Tribulation, "If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened." In other words, the tribulation will be short for the sake of the church, which means the church will be present and not transferred to heaven before this time. What you've just heard is based on an excerpt of a book I've written called The Approaching Apocalypse. You can get information about this book from my website, lastdaysdetective.com. Thank you for listening.